The same punk ethos in a 21st century delivery. Viv Albertine has been a pioneer as part of the Slits, a feminist filmmaker and now a celebrated author. She joins us in the studio to tell us more about her latest book, To Throw Away Unopened. Thanks for joining us, Viv.
Thanks for having me.
Well, the book's title, To Throw Away Unopened, comes courtesy of your mum. It was written on a bag you discovered after she died, and luckily for us, the readers, you didn't follow those instructions because inside there was what we could call her side of your family story. Now, this is your second book. How did your mum make you into a storyteller?
I didn't realise it at the time, but as my mother was bringing me up, she was making me a sort of militant, questioning, fairly antagonistic young woman. She questioned everything on TV. She questioned patriarchy all the time, which in the sort of 60s and late 50s was very unusual, especially from a working class woman. Most of the working classes were very deferential to authority at that time. So she made me who I am. I don't think I would have been a punk or a guitarist, picked up a guitar, as a working class girl. And I often quote Gloria Steinem when she said, "I lived my mother's unlived life." And I think a lot of women of our generation did live the life that our mothers wished they could have lived, but were too sort of hobbled and stymied by the times and post-World War II.
Now, I read that you claim to have had two great loves in your life, your mother and your daughter, and that's certainly apparent reading this book. But if we go back to another generation, another woman in your family, your grandmother actually left you some money in her will, and that, in a roundabout way, changed punk rock history. Can you tell us why?
Yeah, so my grandmother was Swiss-German, and so I come from a long line of Europeans, no English actually in me, and she left me £200, not a lot of money, about 180 euros in her will, and I went out and bought a guitar. Now, I had no money. My family had no money. We were very, very poor, just my mother and my sister and I can't believe, looking back, that my mother let me go and buy a guitar. I couldn't play. No girls played guitar that we knew, electric guitar. I didn't start with acoustic like you're supposed to. So, yes, my grandmother left me the money, but my mother let me spend it on something that could have seemed at that time utterly ridiculous.
And you describe your anger, your internal anger, as something that your mum, in a way, taught you, and it propelled you through life, both personally and professionally. And I think when the Slits burst onto the scene, the band you were in, perhaps one of the most jarring things was that you were angry young women. And to quote you, what you've written about it, "We are on a mission. We pity anyone who doesn't get it." Now, let's get a reminder of that sound with the 1979 track, Typical Girls. Now, going back to the idea of anger, where did it come from and how did it help you create?
I think my mother looked at me young and thought I had no talent. I wasn't clever. I was a very dreamy child, and she wanted to give me a real kick and make me make something of my life. And I didn't respond to anything. So she filled me with anger for injustice, injustice against women and poor people. So we're a very patriarchal, very classist times in England. And no girl from a working class was taken seriously. You were just there to help the male machine go round. You could be a cleaner or a typist, just something to help men do their work and achieve their achievements. And so I dropped out. I didn't want any part of it. I dropped out and went to art school. And it wasn't cool to go to art school in the 70s. You were considered a complete waste of time. But there I managed to sort of build a visual intelligence and a sort of more of a way of expressing myself, not just through anger, but through making work. And I think art saved me, which I've quoted Louise Bourgeois in my book and saying, if it weren't for art, she said, I would have been a murderer. I don't know if I'd have been a murderer, but I would have been a waste of time, I think.
Now, at that time, the late 70s, you were hanging around with some major figures from the punk rock scene, people like Mick Jones from The Clash. You were in a band with Sid Vicious, and you were popping into Vivienne Westwood's shop at the time. Did you feel like you were part of something larger, something that was going to go down in history?
Well, they didn't feel like major figures at the time. You know, they just felt like spotty boys, my age, you know, a bit awkward. I had no respect for them and vice versa. But I did feel with the band, the Slits, we did feel very much that we knew we were doing something incredibly different. We hadn't known of girls playing guitars and drums before. Audiences would come and see us and they'd never seen a girl on stage with an electric guitar before. It's very pre-internet. We saw things years later after they happened from America or whatever. So we were very aware that our writing, our words, our lyrics, our rhythms, everything was breaking new ground, yeah.
And I think people at that time saw music as a radical space for social change, a real place of revolution. Do you think that's still the case today?
Well, certainly back then I had most of my education from music, from musicians travelling the world and singing about what they'd seen, Vietnam War, India, and they'd bring it back and put it on an album. That's how we learnt. That's how I learnt. I learnt more history through music than through my history lessons at school. But now, because of the internet, that's not necessary. So music has dropped as a radical medium in the West. I do feel in more developing countries where, for instance, a female rapper in Afghanistan, she will take her life into her hands every time she does a gig. She is literally likely to be murdered. So there are countries where music is still a radical force, but I feel in the sort of complacent West, not so much.
Mm-hmm. Now, after music and before writing 2 books, you moved into another medium, and that is cinema. You wrote and directed the film Coping with Cupid in 1991. Let's take a look at a short clip. So what I read in your previous memoir, Clothes, 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 Music, 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 Boys, 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 that career chapter in film in the late 80s, early 90s was quite conventionally successful. Doesn't sound very punk.
No, so in the 80s, I started to work for freelance as a director for the BBC in different companies. That was my own film, which was about aliens looking for love on planet Earth, and that was me. But a lot of the time, I just did a McJob, as we call it, but it taught me discipline. It taught me how to work with a team. It wasn't very punk, but it was something I needed to do to learn how to discipline myself and my time.
And both of your books are peppered with some really interesting literary references. I did notice in this latest book some female French and feminist authors there. How did you compile this quite personal literary canon?
I do keep a sort of diary of quotes that really mean something to me, and I find quotes really have helped me throughout my life. And I wanted a whole strata of the book to be just a thank you, a nod, an acknowledgement, not just to writers, but also to my mother, to my aunt, to friends, because a lot of female wisdom is orally transmitted. So sometimes I, acknowledge something my auntie might have said that was very wise. Sometimes it might be Françoise Sagan, and they all are on the same level for me, but I didn't want to look like I'd thought all these interesting thoughts myself, that I wanted to acknowledge I have been influenced, I've learned from other women. And when I was young, I read so many French female authors, and I also read about their lives. I found that when I was 16, 17, it was French female authors that really gave me an example of women who had broken out of sort of patriarchal constraints and were inspiring to me. I didn't find them anywhere else. I didn't have any role models. So I read about Colette, I read about Simone de Beauvoir, Anais Nin, and those women influenced me very much when I was young.
Now, the book is dedicated to both of your parents, in fact, and you managed to blend their accounts with your own. Your dad was actually from France. I think his family originally from Corsica. Do you feel any connection to France, French culture because of that?
I do. I feel my temperament is French, and it's very much sort of fighting with my other side, which is sort of German Swiss, which my mother came from. So yeah, I feel I have the temperament and maybe the feistiness and firiness, the passion of French, and also the love of culture. Very young, my mother never understood why I loved beautiful things. I loved design. I loved art, and there was none of that in my family. And when I used to come to France, I was always amazed how when we sat round a table, any kind of family from any class would speak about filmmaking. They'd know all the directors' names. There was a real engagement with the arts at every level in France that you didn't get in England back then.
Now, finally, we ask all of our guests what's on their cultural radar, and you flagged up work from the photographer Don McCullin, which is currently on show at the Tate in London. Why should we rush to see that?
To me, it was so interesting to walk through the Don McCullin exhibition because he documents every important event during my childhood and teenagehood in a way that you don't get nowadays. I realised that when we saw images in the 70s, they were very highly curated. So we learned to understand what the best image out of a whole roll of film would be and how to choose the most compelling image. And so we had a very highly tuned sense of sort of visual intelligence, really, from those days. And Don McCullin's pictures, each one, even though I even didn't buy the newspapers, each one of those images I remembered. They were so strong, and you saw so few of them. They were much more important, and I think it's an incredibly moving and powerful exhibition.
Great tip. Well, thank you very much for coming in, Viv Albertine. We'll leave you with some of the highlights from that Don McCullin exhibition currently on show at Tate Britain. Do remember to check out our website, and you can also keep up with us on social media too. There's more news coming up on France 24 just after this.
France 24. Every art form,